Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Asia Society Japan Center Ambassador Circle. I am delighted and honored that we have the Japanese ambassador to Australia, Yamagami-san, as today's presenter. I just want to, at the beginning, give you a couple of housekeeping items. We will follow the usual procedures, which is that the ambassador will make some introductory remarks, and he will be using some slides as well. And then after those remarks, Robert Feldman and myself will engage the ambassador in a bit of a fireside chat, and then we shall open the floor for any questions. Now, for your questions from the audience, please type them in the Q&A function, and we will read them out from this end, and then the ambassador will answer. In terms of housekeeping, one additional item, please. As always, this is off the record. So it's Chatham House rules that apply. So it's background, not for attribution. So having said this, again, it's my honor to introduce the current ambassador from Japan to Australia, Yamagami-san. Yamagami-san took up his post in Australia in December last year. And before that, he had a distinguished career at the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. His last post in Tokyo, he was the Director General of Economic Affairs at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So he's very, very well versed to give us insights into both the politics, the security issues, the diplomatic issues, as well as the economic issues. Ambassador Yamagami, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jesper. Ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor to have the opportunity to address you this morning. To tell you the truth, despite moving from Tokyo to Canberra at the end of last year, I do not get a sense that I have moved very far outside of Asia. Indeed, I know that for many people in Australia, there is some confusion about whether they are an outsider or an insider to the Asia region. Every 4 years, Australia signals that it is very much a part of Asia when its soccer team participates in the AFC Asian Cup, making the Japanese team's job harder. I do note, however, that despite this, Japan remains the most successful team with 4 titles. And yet, every year, Australia also becomes an honorary member of Europe at the Eurovision Song Contest, in which it is yet to demonstrate its full potential. As a country which produced music greats like Olivia Newton-John and Kylie Minogue, I have great expectations for their future success. That said, there is no denying that Australia and Japan share a deep regional connection. Geographically, the two nations are situated between the Indian and Pacific Oceans, right at the heart of the Indo-Pacific. This region is our home. To say that our future rests in the Indo-Pacific would not be an exaggeration. As Prime Minister Morrison has rightly pointed out, the Indo-Pacific is a region that has accounted for 2/3 of global growth over the last decade, and it is home to more than half the world's population. Today's topic, the future path for Asia, I would like to speak to you about the future of the Indo-Pacific and more specifically, what Japan and Australia can do together for this region. It is my view that shared commitments to the rules-based trading system, peace and stability, and emissions reduction position Japan and Australia as natural partners. It is in the Indo-Pacific that Japan and Australia have built up our prosperity through our mutual commitment to the rules-based trading system. Though bilateral trade existed between Japan and Australia as far back as the 19th century, the first framework was established 6 decades ago through the Commerce Agreement. Then in 2014, in order to further liberalize trade, the groundbreaking Japan-Australia Economic Partnership Agreement was signed, which covered not only trading goods, but also trading services and investment. From 1968 to 2008, Japan enjoyed the status of Australia's largest trading partner for 40 years. Today, exports to Japan account for around 10% of Australia's total trade, reaching $90 billion. The liberalization of bilateral trade also helped to forge a deep trust between Japan and Australia. Business leaders were given confidence in the market and an eagerness to invest. Indeed, Japanese direct investment has more than doubled over the past 12 years. Today, Japan is the second largest source of foreign investment in Australia, providing a remarkable $132 billion. But the question is, how can we ensure that our entire region enjoys such prosperity? As I'm sure everyone here is aware, this is where a free and open Indo-Pacific, supported by a rules-based trading order, is important. In recent years, Japan has been pursuing a foreign policy based on the vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific. Through the improvement of regional connectivity, infrastructure development, trade and investment, Japan has been striving to ensure this international public good brings prosperity to all. In this context, it was together with Australia that Japan became the driving force behind the establishment of APEC. It is also together that Japan and Australia are working towards the expansion of the CPTPP, and it is together that Japan and Australia are working closely towards reform of the WTO. In bilateral talks last year, Prime Minister Morrison and Prime Minister Suga publicly agreed that trade should never be used as a tool to apply political pressure. Given what has been transpiring in Australia's trade relationship with others, this was a strong and clear message Japan and Australia delivered to the world. It is a message which will continue to underline the importance of the rules-based trading system for decades to come. However, prosperity cannot be envisaged without peace and stability. Japan and Australia understand that these are vital precursors to growth in our region. At the historical first ever leaders meeting of the Quad, just under 2 months ago, our two nations, along with the United States and India, agreed to support principles such as the rule of law, freedom of navigation and overflight, peaceful settlement of disputes, democratic values, and territorial integrity. For this, Japan and Australia are well placed to cooperate both multilaterally and bilaterally. As a natural consequence of the deep trust built up through decades of trade and investment, Japan and Australia's relationship has been elevated to a special strategic partnership and diversified to include cooperations in areas like defense and intelligence. Today, Japan and Australia regularly participate in joint exercises. This year, most recently, Japan and Australia participated in a multilateral exercise known as the ARC-21 with the US and France. A joint transit in the South China Sea was also conducted. Concerning North Korea's nuclear weapons and missile development, close cooperation was undertaken on the prohibition of ship-to-ship transfers in the East China Sea. And Australia participated in the exercise Malabar, a naval exercise traditionally involving India, the US, and Japan. For Australia, this was historically significant as it marked its first participation in 13 years. Negotiations on the Australia-Japan Reciprocal Access Agreement have now entered their final stage. Joint exercises have already been performed in places like Queensland, the Northern Territory, and Hokkaido. Of course, the health of a nation is also essential for peace and stability, which is why equal vaccine access for our region is a priority. In February, Japan increased its contribution to the global initiative, the COVAX AMC, to ensure that the world's developing countries, including those in the Indo-Pacific, have access to safe and effective vaccines. A total of $200 million has now been committed to by Japan. In June this year, Japan will co-host the COVAX AMC Summit with the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization, Gavi, with the aim of securing further funding from donors and the private sector. Australia views this as a priority too. Along with the US and India, Japan and Australia have committed to supporting countries in the Indo-Pacific through the difficult circumstances of this global pandemic. The first ever leaders meeting of the Quad also identified emissions reduction as a priority for the Indo-Pacific. Here again, Japan and Australia can work together as we share a vision for a low emissions future. And with a long history of economic complementarity in the resources sector, we are natural partners in the global fight against climate change. Only a few months ago, I had the pleasure of attending the commencement ceremony of the world's first global hydrogen supply chain, HESC. And I must tell you, the sheer scale of this project is really astonishing. Pioneer technology is being used to produce and transport hydrogen all the way from Victoria's Latrobe Valley to Kobe, Japan. Driven by all Japanese multi-industry consortium, this project success will have an enormous impact. This type of project is not unique to the state of Victoria. In every state I have traveled here in Australia, the hydrogen industry is being developed. And Japanese companies are right there in the thick of it. The vast potential of hydrogen could very well be the key to reducing emissions. This will benefit not just Japan and Australia, but our entire region. To conclude, I would like to reiterate that Japan and Australia's shared values and strategic interests in areas such as trade, defense, health, and emissions reduction have situated us as natural partners in supporting our region. I am determined to the utmost to strengthen Japan-Australia bilateral ties and uphold our shared values in order to promote a free and open Indo-Pacific. Because what we do here for our region benefits us all. It benefits Asia, and it benefits the entire global community. Thank you. Thank you very much for listening.
Ambassador Yamagami, thank you very much for these, insightful, introductory remarks here. I'd like to now move on to the fireside chat. If I may, I would like to ask the first question. It is excellent news to again hear you, Ambassador, underscore how dense and how cooperative and how constructive the bilateral relationship between Japan and Australia is there. It was also very encouraging to hear you outline that the Quad talks, so the talks Japan, Australia, India, and the United States, appear to be moving beyond just their original design, which I think was focused on security, towards trade, defense, health, as well as the environment. Let me ask you a first question. Do you think that, in this reshaping of Indo-Pacific, do you think that the Quad is going to be the primary force, or what other, institutional frameworks do you look at?
As far as, thank you, Jesper. As far as I'm concerned, I tend to regard, Quad as a vehicle to promote the vision of, this free and open Indo-Pacific. So, it is not necessarily a solid institution. For example, if any members in the region, in the Indo-Pacific region, support, this idea of, free and open Indo-Pacific, I think, the ideas such as, freedom of navigation, overflight, trade and investment, liberalization, quality infrastructure development, this kind of idea, can serve as an international public good and very well be supported by many others. So, Quad is not an exclusive institution. The idea Quad is promoting, could be, open-ended, and any country can join. So, for example, a number of, European countries, including UK, France, and Germany, are beginning to, show their interest in this idea of, free and open in the Pacific, and they are welcome to join us in that regard.
Yeah, fantastic, Ambassador. If I may lift up, the talk, and it's early in the morning for all of us, but thinking sort of on the big macro level. It is often said that Japan's role in Asia, as well as in the world, is primary as a rule shaper rather than as a rule maker. Could you, you have so much experience, in dealing with this. Could you give us your personal view on how you view the difference between rule shaping and rule making, and what really, in your personal view, Japan's ambition should be?
Well, if you really think Japan is not a rule maker and Japan is a rule taker or shaper, whatever in your terms, let us join the UN Security Council as a permanent member. That is as simple as that. Well, Jesper, I've been in the foreign service for almost 30 years, 38 years by now, and I think this level of Japan being rules taker is almost getting to cliche. And let me tell you something. Japan has been in many regards a rules maker, and we have done our fair share of contributions to making rules. For example, Japan has been on the front line of addressing challenges posed by the rise of China. Japan was one of a number of countries which was subjected to trade restrictions for political matters. So, about 10 years ago, China's rare earth mineral export to Japan was virtually stopped. What did Japan do at the time? We all recall we brought the case to the WTO. We won the case. And this certainly laid a foundation for many other countries to follow. So what Australia is now doing in terms of its barley export to China, its wine export to China, almost resembles what Japan did about 10 years ago. If you do not call it a rules making or precedent making, what other would you call it? And when it comes to this Quad, meetings, I think Japan has been a consistent supporter of developing Quad, even to the level of summit meeting. So there are number of incidents where Japan played a pivotal role. CPTP, APEC is another example. So, well, rather than dwelling on this issue of whether rules taker or rules maker, why don't you join Japan in terms of making rules and observing rules? I think as far as I'm concerned, I regard Japan is a good country which is upholding these important universal values of the rules of law.
No, fantastic. I'm so glad, to hear you speak with confidence and with ambition. And I think certainly objectively speaking, over the last decade, Japan has indeed been stepping up and has become more of a rule maker. Now, let me ask one additional question. You touched very briefly upon the rise of China. And as you know, there's some discussion trying to put, the rise of China, particularly against the United States of America, in terms of the Thucydides trap. So that, one waning power and one rising power, ultimately a military conflict may be inevitable. May I ask you your personal view on the Thucydides trap, and what would make you confident that indeed it can be avoided?
Well, yes, but first of all, I have to pose, my question about this, juxtaposition of U.S. versus China, because when it comes to, these, challenges presented by the rise of China, U.S. is not the only country, which is facing it. In Europe, Norway, has, facing, this issue, and, so has been, UK, Germany, France, many other countries, in East Asia, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, India, Vietnam. So, this is a, issue of common concern to the international community when it comes to how to address the rise of Japan's continental. There's two important issues here. First is how to incorporate the rising power into the rules-based international order. I think that is most important task facing us. For example, several years ago, we had this international arbitration ruling in the South China Sea, but which is being given sort of blind eyes by this particular country. So how to include them in this web of rules and international norms is a question we have to tackle together. Second, in terms of what you call Thucydides trap, certainly whether it's true or not, we do need a certain amount of deterrence, because in order not to escalate the tensions, deterrence works. History has proved it on many occasions. So in that regard, there is a lot Japan should do or Japan can do in terms of increasing its deterrence. Thank you.
Fantastic. Robbie, I'd like to bring you on the stage and engage in the discussion. Robbie.
Thank you very much. Mr. Ambassador, let me thank you for including me in the discussion today. I'd like to follow up first on your points about Japan-Australia cooperation in the hydrogen supply chain. It's very encouraging to see this supply chain get off the ground. It's a major success for the two countries working together. However, when I talk about this with my clients around the world, they say, oh, that one's based on brown coal. It's not really clean. What's the big deal? Now, my answer is, look, we need a supply chain. Once we get green hydrogen, that'll, make it a better supply chain. But one of the most encouraging things I see in Australia-Japan relations now are some of the projects in Western Australia where there are solar to hydrogen projects going forward. I also see some amazing scientific progress. Some Australian universities, some Japanese universities working on solar to hydrogen conversion. Could you tell us a little bit more about how Japan and Australia are working together on the scientific side of developing green hydrogen?
Oh, thank you, Mr. Feldman. And in fact, I had a dinner with Australia's energy minister, Mr. Angus Taylor, last night, and we had a fair amount of discussions on hydrogen. And it is true that cooperation between Japan and Australia on hydrogen is evolving, but we do share the strong awareness that hydrogen is the future. And as you rightly pointed out, Mr. Feldman, there are a number of projects going on. This project in Lateral Valley is, yes, it is from, low quality coal, brown coal, but at the same time, in Western Australia, there is another project. And there is also another project, trying to make use of ammonia. So it's quite in what you call nebulous state of affairs, and which is really encouraging to me, as Japanese ambassador to Australia. Like in the automobile industry, once again, in hydrogen, there is a healthy and robust competition going on amongst many players concerned. So throughout this competition, I think in a few years' time, we will come to economically viable and sustainable methods. Here, I'm not in a position to totally deny the importance of blue hydrogen. Some people might position it, regarded as a sort of middle point of reaching to the green hydrogen. CCS is also another element here. So, whether green or blue hydrogen, I'm quite convinced that, as I said, hydrogen is the future, and we are putting, utmost efforts into materializing it as a new source of energy.
Mm-hmm. Thanks very much. That's very encouraging to hear. I'm looking forward to a lot more Japan-Australia cooperation on this, along with some new developments inside Japan for local creation of hydrogen as well. But let me shift a little bit to a different technology issue, which is the issue of digital transformation. Okay, McKinsey has estimated that over the next 10 years, Japan will lose about 16 million jobs to automation. It has also estimated that there will be a need for about 10 or 11 million people to shift jobs into new opportunities, a net decline of about 5 million. These are major challenges for Japan. But of course, digital transformation is not something unique to Japan. I have a Japanese phrase that I use for this: AI wa kokkyo o koeru. So AI crosses borders. How do you sort of contrast and compare the approaches to digital transformation in Australia and in Japan?
Thank you for your question. When you mentioned digital transformation, I was reminded of my experience of having worked for G20 meeting in Osaka. When Japan chaired G20, one of the keywords was DFAT, data free flow with trust. And yes, Australia and Japan joins about this important concept of data free flow with trust. And we are now trying to specify those rules on such fora as WTO. Australia and Japan are working together at WTO. And also there is another commonality between the two countries in terms of our emphasis on digital agency. I understand, under the Digital Transformation Act, this Digital Transformation Agency, DTA, was established in Australia 2016. So here, Japan and Australia are looking at the same direction. Interestingly, I hasten to add that on the ground of business activities, Japanese corporations, such as NEC and NTT, Hitachi, are helping smart city idea in Sydney. Western suburbs of Sydney, Japanese consortium corporations are being built to help Sydney develop a smart city. So this is another form of business cooperation between Australia and Japan.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. Jesper, may I have one more?
Of course, Robbie.
Thank you very much. Let me shift things now to the approaches that Australia and Japan have taken in the fight against COVID. The results have been different in different ways across the two countries. When you compare what Australia did on COVID and what Japan did on COVID, what do you think the two countries can learn from each other? In particular, this question of management of technology, creating a scientific base, using the science, diffusion of the technology throughout the country. Where do you think the countries have done well, have done badly, and what can they learn from each other?
That is a very good question, Mr. Feldman. And I think, simply put, Australia stands out in its handling of COVID. And believe me, their measures are so strict. When I arrived at Canberra, I was put into this 2 weeks quarantine, and I couldn't move out. What I did was just stay inside, and this quarantine of 2 weeks was one of the toughest and the strictest, most strict. And I think throughout these experiences, one can say that it has turned out Japanese people are not as compliant as Aussies. Mm-hmm. So yes, Australia stands out. They did a marvelous job in handling COVID. That said, we also need to note a number of differences between Japan and Australia, because unlike Australia, which has land size 5 times as big as that of Japan, 20 times as big as that of Japan, and population is 1/5, which means density of population is 1/100th compared with Japan. But in Japan, Tokyo density of population and flow of people between Tokyo and neighboring states, Osaka neighboring states, totally different situations. So you cannot just draw a simple analysis, analogy between Australia and Japan. But that said, Japan's practice of voluntary, infection control measures, such as wearing masks, was, gradually being recognized as effective and legitimate by many people here. So throughout all of this, there are a number of lessons Australia and Japan can, study from each other's experiences. That is my take.
Thank you very much. Jesper, back to you.
Great, fantastic, Ambassador. I'd like to now open the floor to, and I think we've got, a couple of questions from the audience. Sawako, if you'd be so kind to read them out, and then the Ambassador will answer.
Good morning, Ambassador. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. So we have quite a number of questions from Australia as well as America and many countries. So we have a question from Barry. How should Japan and the U.S. respond to Chinese trade sanctions on Australia?
Thank you, Sawako-san. I think my answer is twofold. One, as I emphasized this morning, settle trade disputes in accordance with international rules. I think that is an important lesson we learned through Japan's experience of having had to deal with their economic measures, i.e. bring the case to WTO, and we won the case. So gradually, steadily, their restrictive measures were rescinded. That's number one. Number two is try to reduce dependency on that country. For example, in the case of Japan's rare earth minerals, at one time, Japan's dependency rate on them reached as high as 90%. But through cooperation with Australia, US, we did our best to reduce this dependency rate, and now it stands around 60%. Some might call it a small step, but it's a very, very important step. So these are kind of lessons we would like to see our, our friends in Australia learn from Japan's experiences. And I'm certain that this is a joint lesson for Japan, United States, Australia, and many other like-minded trading partners. Thank you.
Thank you. We have another question. I believe this is from Stephen in Australia. It's in regards to hydrogen. Japan will need to import an enormous amount of hydrogen to meet its carbon emission reduction targets. Does Japan see Australia as being the primary source of its hydrogen?
Thank you, Sawako-san. My answer to this question from Steve is simply yes. You are right, and we do regard Australia as the most important partner when it comes to producing and transporting hydrogen. One of the methods, this lateral valley method, is quite stunning. It will liquefy, make hydrogen to a liquid at the port in near Melbourne, Hastings Port, at the temperature of minus 253 degrees. This requires, really advanced technology, and I have been so impressed. So certainly, we'd like to see hydrogen, cultivating the new frontier of cooperation between our two countries, Australia and Japan. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now we go to a question in regards to the Quad and ASEAN. This is a question from an anonymous attendee. Some have stated that the rise of the Quad, the ASEAN has now been pushed into irrelevance. What role does ASEAN have or can have with the existence of the Quad?
Thank you, Sawako-san. My simple, once again, my simple answer is no way. ASEAN, has a plenty of room to play here. As I said, this morning, Quad is a vehicle to promote this important vision of free and open Indo-Pacific. And when it comes to this vision, free and open Indo-Pacific, I think this is public, international public good, which can bring benefit to all the members in the region, including ASEAN countries. If you look at, freedom of navigation, overflight, regional connectivity, infrastructure development, certainly it will benefit ASEAN countries. So, we would like to welcome ASEAN with open arms. In fact, ASEAN came up with its own idea, almost equivalent of, FOIP, free and open Indo-Pacific, themselves. So there is a lot where Australia, Japan, United States, and also ASEAN can do together. That's my answer.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now we go to another question from one of our founding members in the U.S., from Glenn Fukushima in Washington, D.C. This is another question with regards to how Australia and Japan can work together to lead. In addition to APEC, CPTPP, RCP, and FTAP, what do you see as the next stage of Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific regional economic integration? What country do you think should participate in it? And would it include US, China, Taiwan? What do you think?
Well, thank you, Sawako-san, and my good old friend Glenn. Since this is a question from Glenn, I would like to, once again, emphasize to Glenn, we are waiting for Americans to come back to TPP. That's my long-held dream, and you can make it, realized. Yes, when it comes to CPTPP, while we are waiting for our American friends to come back, now we are beginning to see negotiation with the UK getting started. So, countries like, United Kingdom, some ASEAN, member states, and, Taiwan, they are on the doorsteps of joining CPTPP, according to, my understanding. And RCEP, it was a bit of disappointment to everybody that, we couldn't get, India on board, but certainly the door, to India is open when it comes to RCEP. So through, these, endeavors, including CPTPP expansion, India's integration, possible integration into RCEP, there are, continued robust movement toward regional integration. So I think, under the new administration of the United States, hopefully there will be a renewed, consideration on the merits of America, getting back to the Indo-Pacific's economic integration. Thank you, Glenn, for your excellent question.
Ambassador, here's a question with regards to a defense industry from an anonymous attendee. Currently, the cooperation between Australia and Japanese defense industry is positive but minimal. Does Japan view this as an important step to increase defense collaboration? How can we expand this relationship to gain the benefits of technology transfer and capability development?
Thank you for another good question. Yes, it is possible, and I do not necessarily regard it of question that there is a lot of room for us to improve defense cooperation. Simply put, there is a lot we can do together. One example is this conclusion of reciprocal access agreement. Already we are conducting joint exercises in such area as Queensland or Northern Territory, or in Japan's case, Hokkaido. Australian forces are coming to Hokkaido to conduct joint exercise with Japanese self-defense forces. But once this important agreement, reciprocal access agreement, is concluded, we will have an institutional framework to conduct joint exercises and drills between Australia and Japan. And certainly it will facilitate more trainings, exercises to to be conducted both in Australia and in Japan. This is so this is one of those examples where we can enhance defense cooperation. Personally, I'd like to see more of defense equipment cooperation. It is a bit disappointing that we could not succeed in selling Japanese Soryu type submarines to Australia, but that's just one of possibility, and there are many other potential items. So through this kind of endeavor, I think we can further strengthen defense cooperation between Japan and Australia.
Thank you, Ambassador. We have another question with regards to the trade relationship. This is from another anonymous attendee. With Australia's deteriorating trade relationship with China, what opportunities do you see Australian companies looking to target Japan as a new market for trade? And in particular, which sectors do you think Australian companies could target? I think I'm really particularly interested in this question because I recently read your interview when you visited to Adelaide, and you talked about importing more Australian wine, which I totally agree to. So your comment, please.
Well, that is exactly a kind of question I anticipated this morning, and thank you for asking this timely question. Yes, I think wine is a great potential. Whenever I talk to Australians about wine market situation in Japan, Aussies are really surprised to hear all the Australian wines we know in Japan tend to be Jacob's Creek and Yellowtail, and many Aussies are not happy about that fact. Penfolds, for example, very expensive, high quality South Australia, Shiraz wine, Barossa Valley. That's not really accessible, when it comes to Japanese, wine lovers. Or there are many other great wine, including, Margaret River or Hunter Valley. List goes on and on and on. But Japanese wine consumers are not in a position to be able to enjoy a wide variety of Australian wine, because so far our export efforts are being concentrated toward the Chinese market. So this is high time for Australian wine exporters to take a renewed look at the Japanese market or other Asian market, or including US and the European market as well. So I think it takes two to tango. While we do need further export efforts, we do need more Japanese consumers to be aware of the wide variety of Australian wine, which could be available at our lunch and dinner table.
Thank you, Ambassador Yamagami. We really look forward to tasting more wonderful Australian wine. I think this will be our last question, and it's from one of our founding members, Tad Johnson, and it's in regards to education. And I'm studying abroad, Japanese students studying abroad in Australia. As you know, there are many Japanese students who are studying at universities in Australia, and many of those students returned to Japan at the beginning of the pandemic. The Australian government has not announced any plans about when it would allow these students who were previously living and studying in Australia to return, to continue their studies. My friends whose children are in the situation tell me that their children feel a big disadvantage in their studies because they are not allowed to return to Australia. Please tell us about your efforts to encourage the Australian government to allow currently enrolled students to return soon.
Well, before I go into that point, I would like to emphasize the importance of more robust student exchanges, which could take place between Japan and Australia. Based upon my experience of having been to graduate school in the United States. The attraction of Australia or Australia's universities, tend to, hide behind those of American universities and British university. I think Australia, university deserve, more attention from Japanese students. So do Japanese universities from Australian students. So I would love to see, more student exchanges taking place between our two countries. Coming back to the, original, point of the questions, I would like to refrain myself from, talking about specific points of any import restrictions. But after all, this all comes, from COVID preventive measures, and each country has its own, discretion when it comes to control of, entry and immigration. As far as I'm concerned, I strongly hope that things will get back to normal as soon as possible. And certainly, we would not spare any effort to see travel bubble, resumed between Japan and Australia. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. We have one last question. It's from our founding member as well, Kosei Kobayashi-san. He says, thank you very much for your instructive speech. I have a question about the Tokyo Olympics. How does the Australian people feel about the Tokyo Olympics? And how about in particular, the Australian national team?
Yes, I have been talking with a number of Aussies about the Tokyo Olympics because they keep on asking me questions. Are they going to take place as scheduled? That's the most frequent question asked to me. And they are certainly, strongly hoping that Tokyo Olympics will, take place as scheduled. And they even, go further to say, well, this is the turn of Japan. Since, Japan is a host, Japan will do it. And Japan can do it, especially under this adversity. Japan has shown its resilience before, and we count on Japan. That's the kind of message I keep on hearing from my Australian friends and partners. So yes, there is a strong expectation on the part of Australians, most Australians, to see Tokyo Olympics go ahead as scheduled. Of course, I tell you this because, although I know there are a number of opinions, back in Japan, but as a diplomat, stationed overseas, I would like to see, many athletes from Australia, go to, Tokyo and, join this endeavor of many people, coming together. After all, to me, it is a role of Japan, which keeps uphold a long tunnel of COVID, and many countries in the international community count on Japan's prowess and capability to do it. That's my take. Thank you.
Ambassador, thank you so much for your frank and candid remarks. I was so happy to learn about your two ambitions. The one ambition, obviously, being to present Japan even stronger as a rule maker in Indo-Pacific and in Asia-Pacific. And then, of course, the second ambition, I like very much that your ambition is to promote Australian wine more aggressively in Japan. And I very, very much hope that we can do so together, when you're here in Japan next. Certainly you're a welcome friend and guest to the Asia Society here in Japan, our centers in Melbourne, as well as, of course, the headquarters in New York. We would love to continue to engage with you. I want to thank you very, very much for today's sessions. If you have any final comments or remarks, please let us know.
Thank you, Jesper, for your kind words. As ambassador here, my role is to raise the profile of Japan in Australia, as well as help raise the profile of Australia in Japan. So in that regard, I welcome any visitor from Japan to Australia. So if you have any opportunity to stop by in Canberra, do let me know. Thank you.
Absolutely. And I can also introduce you to some of the new wine growers here in Japan. As you know, there are some pretty interesting developments on the wine front. But again, Ambassador Yamagami, thank you so much. Now, for the audience, this concludes our ambassador circle. The next one is